What if the most fascinating figures from across time could meet for the first time in the hereafter, free to speak as they never could in life? Welcome to History's Afterlife. Tonight, in the elegant salons of eternity, two women who redefined what it meant to think and create as a woman encounter each other. Figures who challenged conventions in vastly different realms, yet both understood the delicate relationship between liberation and compromise. First, Gabrielle Coco Chanel, born in 1883 to poverty and abandonment, who transformed herself into the most influential fashion designer of the 20th century. From an orphanage in rural France, she rose to liberate women from the corseted constraints of Victorian dress, creating a new aesthetic of elegant simplicity that freed the female form. Her little black dress, her suits, her perfumes all became symbols of modern femininity. Yet her legacy carries shadows. Her affair with a Nazi officer during the occupation, her use of wartime laws to try to seize control of her perfume company from Jewish partners, and her lifelong struggle to reconcile ambition with integrity. Second, Hannah Arendt, born in 1906 to a middle-class Jewish family in Germany, who became one of the 20th century's most profound political thinkers. Forced to flee Nazi Germany, she spent years as a stateless person before finding refuge in America, where she revolutionized our understanding of totalitarianism, freedom, and the human condition. Her works, The Origins of Totalitarianism and The Human Condition, challenged how we think about politics, power, and responsibility. Like Chanel, she knew the weight of moral compromise. Her controversial coverage of the Eichmann trial sparked debates about judgment, forgiveness, and the nature of evil that continue today. One liberated women's bodies, the other liberated minds from political illusion. Both understood that freedom comes with uncomfortable choices. Tonight, the fashion revolutionary meets the political philosopher.
Mademoiselle Arendt, I know your reputation, though I confess I find philosophy rather abstract. I prefer to work with my hands, with things one can see and touch.
And I must confess, I've always found fashion rather superficial, though I suppose we both concern ourselves with how humans present themselves to the world.
Fashion is liberation, mademoiselle. When I freed women from corsets, when I put them in comfortable clothes that allowed them to move, to work, to live, that was political as surely as any of your writings. You theorize about freedom. I gave it form and fabric.
Liberation through consumption. How very American of you. Though I grant that the personal can indeed be political when it challenges existing power structures.
American? No, mademoiselle. Essentially feminine. Before me, women dressed as men wanted them to dress. Ornamental, helpless, imprisoned in whalebone and wire. I said a woman should be able to run for a bus, to work in an office, to live her own life. That jersey dress that shocked everyone in 1916, that was revolution made wearable.
Yet you remained dependent on those same male financiers, did you not? Your perfume empire, your business partnerships. Surely these required compromises with the very power structures you claim to have challenged.
One must be practical. Beauty costs money, and someone must provide it. I made my accommodations where necessary.
Accommodations? An interesting choice of words, given your associations during the war.
During the German occupation, Chanel had an affair with Baron Hans Gunther von Dinklage, a German intelligence officer. She also attempted to use Nazi racial laws to gain control of Parfum Chanel from her Jewish business partners, the Wertheimers.
I survived. In wartime, survival requires choices that peacetime morality cannot judge. You, of all people, should understand that.
Indeed, I understand survival. I fled Germany, lived stateless for years, understood what it meant to have no political existence. But survival and collaboration are different things.
Collaboration? I fell in love with a man who happened to be German. Are the heart's choices now subject to political approval?
When that man represents a regime dedicated to the extermination of people like me, yes, I believe they are. Love does not exist in a political vacuum.
How easy it is to judge from a distance. You ran away, which was wise. I don't fault you for it. But some of us stayed. Some of us had to find ways to preserve what we had built. And what I built was more than a business. It was a new way of seeing women, of women seeing themselves.
Preserve it for whom? Your Jewish partners whom you tried to dispossess? Or for yourself?
For every woman who puts on a simple black dress and feels powerful instead of pretty. For every woman who chooses comfort over conformity. You dismiss as aesthetics as superficial. But a woman's relationship with her own body, her own image, that is the foundation of all other freedoms. How can she think freely if she cannot move freely? How can she work if she cannot breathe?
You used the tools of oppression to do so. You cannot separate your business dealings from the regime that made them possible.
Arendt wrote extensively about the banality of evil, how ordinary people become complicit in totalitarian systems through small compromises and moral blindness. Her analysis of Adolf Eichmann, the Nazi bureaucrat who organised the logistics of the Holocaust's deportation trains, suggested that evil often stems from thoughtlessness rather than inherent wickedness. Covering his 1961 trial in Jerusalem, Arendt controversially argued that Eichmann was not a monster, but an ordinary man who became complicit in genocide through careerism and failure to think critically about his actions.
You speak of complicity as if there was always a choice. But when a regime controls everything, food, shelter, business licenses, what choice does one have but to accommodate or starve?
There is always a choice. Though the options may be terrible, the question is whether we acknowledge the moral weight of our choices or pretend they were forced upon us.
And what was the moral weight of your choice to write about Eichmann as you did? Many found that excusing evil as well.
How do you mean?
This banality of evil you described. It sounds almost like an excuse. I was only following orders, but in philosophical language.
That is precisely the opposite of what I argued. I said that evil often comes from the inability to think, to judge, to take responsibility for one's actions. Eichmann's ordinariness made him more dangerous, not less culpable.
Yet your analysis seemed to diminish the particular horror of what was done, as if systematic murder were merely the result of bureaucratic thoughtlessness.
The horror was not diminished by understanding its mechanisms. If anything, the fact that such evil could emerge from ordinary thoughtlessness makes it more terrifying, not less.
Or more forgivable. After all, if evil is banal, if it stems from mere thoughtlessness rather than deliberate malice, then perhaps we are all capable of it under the right circumstances.
That is exactly my point. We are all capable of it, which is why we must remain vigilant against our own capacity for moral failure.
Arendt's analysis of Eichmann sparked fierce debate, particularly among Holocaust survivors, who felt she had minimised both the perpetrator's guilt and the victim's suffering. Her intellectual approach to evil struck many as cold, even heartless.
Perhaps that is what disturbs me about your philosophy. It suggests that my choices during the war were not aberrations, but natural human responses to impossible circumstances.
And does that possibility frighten you?
It should frighten everyone. If you are right, then morality is far more fragile than we like to believe.
Fragile, yes, but not impossible. The capacity for moral choice remains, even under the worst conditions. The question is whether we exercise it.
But how does one judge? In the moment, faced with immediate pressures, how does one know which choice serves a greater good?
One doesn't always know. That is a tragedy of human action. We must act without complete knowledge of the consequences. But we can still choose to act thoughtfully rather than thoughtlessly.
In fashion, I always said that elegance is refusal. Refusing the unnecessary, the vulgar, the merely fashionable. Perhaps morality requires similar editing.
An interesting analogy, though I would say morality requires addition as much as subtraction. Adding consideration, adding judgment, adding responsibility for our actions.
Yet you write about freedom as if it were purely political. What of personal freedom? The freedom to create, to love, to build something beautiful. When I created Chanel No. 5, I wasn't thinking about politics. I was thinking about capturing the scent of a woman who chooses her own destiny. That perfume has outlasted governments, outlasted wars. Beauty endures when politics fails.
Personal freedom without political freedom is an illusion. You cannot separate your creativity from the conditions that make it possible or impossible.
But surely beauty has value independent of politics. A perfect dress, a sublime perfume. These transcend political circumstances. They speak to something eternal in human nature. The desire for elegance, for grace, for transformation.
Do they? Or do they simply provide comfort while political reality shapes every aspect of their creation and consumption?
Both women grappled with the relationship between individual expression and political reality. Chanel believed in the transformative power of personal style. Arendt argued that genuine freedom required active political participation and responsibility.
You make everything so heavy. Must we see politics in every gesture, every choice? When I put a woman in a suit that lets her stride confidently into a boardroom, when I give her a fragrance that makes her feel mysterious and powerful, that is not political theory. That is lived freedom. That is democracy in action.
Not politics in the sense of party affiliation or ideology, but politics in the sense of how we live together, how we treat one another, how we create and maintain the world we share.
What of joy? What of pleasure? Your philosophy seems to leave little room for simple human happiness. Yet, when a woman looks in the mirror and loves what she sees, when she feels beautiful and strong, that moment of joy is worth 1,000 political treatises. It changes how she moves through the world, how others see her, how she sees herself.
On the contrary, I believe political freedom is necessary precisely because it creates space for joy, for pleasure, for the full range of human experience. But these require protection.
Protection from whom?
From those who would reduce human beings to mere functions, workers, consumers, instruments of ideology. From those who would eliminate the space for spontaneity, for new beginnings.
When I designed clothes, I always tried to preserve something unpredictable. A line that shouldn't work but does. A combination that surprises even me.
Yes, that capacity for surprise, for newness, that is what I mean by human freedom. The ability to begin something unprecedented.
But your writing about freedom seems so intellectual, so removed from the actual experience of creating, of risking, of building something from nothing.
Perhaps that is a limitation of philosophy. It must generalize from particular experiences. But the thinking itself is a form of action, a way of preserving space for human agency.
Tell me honestly, when you wrote about evil, about responsibility, were you thinking of people like me? People who made compromises during the war?
I was thinking of all of us, of the ordinary people who become complicit in extraordinary evil through small compromises, through failures of imagination, through the simple desire to continue living as before.
And do you condemn us for it?
Condemnation is too simple. What interests me is understanding how it happens, why it happens, how we might recognize and resist it in ourselves.
That seems almost generous.
Not generous, necessary. If we cannot understand how ordinary people become complicit in evil, we cannot guard against it in ourselves or our societies.
This exchange captures the tension between Arendt's analytical approach to moral failure and the personal shame of those who lived through such failures. Can intellectual understanding bridge the gap between theory and lived experience?
You know, I spent years after the war trying to rebuild my reputation, to return from exile. I told myself I had done nothing wrong, that survival justified everything.
And now?
Now, I wonder if survival is ever justification enough, whether the person who emerged from those compromises was still me.
That question, whether we remain ourselves through our compromises, may be the most important question we can ask.
But how does one answer it? How does one judge oneself fairly?
Perhaps by considering not only our intentions, but our actions. Not only our survival, but what we preserved and what we sacrificed in that survival.
I preserved my business, my independence, my creative freedom. I sacrificed, perhaps more than I care to admit.
The capacity for that admission may itself be a form of freedom. The freedom to judge oneself honestly, to take responsibility for one's choices.
Mademoiselle, our discussion has reopened questions I thought I had settled long ago.
And you have reminded me that freedom must be lived, not merely theorized. Perhaps the gap between thought and action is narrower than I sometimes suggest.
Perhaps, though I suspect you will always think more carefully than I about the consequences of freedom.
And you will always create more boldly than I.
In the end, perhaps Chanel and Arendt represent different responses to the 20th century's central challenge: how to maintain human dignity and freedom in the face of totalitarian pressure. Chanel chose survival through adaptation, preserving her creative vision while making morally questionable compromises. Arendt chose exile and intellectual resistance, maintaining moral clarity while sacrificing homeland and stability. Their conversation reveals that both approaches carried costs. Chanel's legacy forever shadowed by wartime choices, Arendt's insights sometimes seeming to minimize individual suffering in service of broader understanding. Yet both women contributed to human freedom. Chanel by expanding possibilities for female self-expression, Arendt by analysing the conditions that make freedom possible or impossible. Their meeting suggests that moral judgment must balance understanding with accountability, recognising both the constraints that shape human choice and the responsibility that remains even under the worst circumstances. Perhaps the greatest freedom is the ability to examine our own compromises honestly, to learn from our failures, and to create new possibilities for those who come after.